Welcome to The Explainer. We're going to dive right into the incredibly fascinating origins of the Indian National Congress. We're talking about a journey from a tiny, seemingly compromised gathering of intellectuals right to the absolute bedrock of a massive independence movement. If you've ever found yourself wondering how a nation as vast, as diverse as India actually managed to find a singular political voice to stand up to the might of the British Empire, well, this is where that story really kicks off. Okay, let's start with a pretty staggering number. 72. Just 72 delegates showed up to the very first session of the Congress at the Gokudas Tejpal Sanskrit College in Bombay. This was way back in December 1885. I mean, think about that. The very seeds of a movement that would go on to mobilize literally millions of people and overthrow an empire. It all started in a single room with just a few dozen folks, led by W.C. Banerjee. It really just goes to show you that massive historical game changers often start with a remarkably small group of committed people. Now, here is where things get a bit controversial. There's this wild historical theory about how the Congress was actually created. See, the organization's final shape was heavily driven by a guy named A.O. Hume, and he was a retired English civil servant. So you have to ask, why on earth would a former British official help kickstart an Indian political organization? Well, a very prominent theory suggests Hume did this basically to act as a safety valve. The thinking was he wanted to release the dangerously growing discontent among Indians in a controlled, peaceful way. He even managed to convince the viceroy, Lord Dufferin, to just let it happen. And hey, this wasn't just some fringe British conspiracy. Later extremist leaders like Lala Lajpat Rai absolutely believed this safety valve theory was the exact reason the Congress was allowed to exist in the first place. All right, Section 1, the birth of the Congress. So, how did this whole thing actually take shape? It wasn't an overnight accident, that's for sure. It was a rapid, highly systematic buildup. The groundwork was carefully laid out in the late 1870s and early 1880s by key architects, guys like Surendranath Banerjee and Ananda Mohan Bose. They put together the Indian National Conference in 1883 and then again in 1885, pulling in representatives from major towns all over the subcontinent. And then boom, the first official Congress session hits in December 1885. From that point on, they made it a point to meet every single December, rotating to a different part of the country to build a truly national footprint. A massive milestone hit in 1890 when Kadambini Ganguly, the very first female graduate of Calcutta University, actually addressed the Congress. That was a huge, deeply symbolic statement right from the jump, committing to giving Indian women their rightful place in the national struggle. But here's a really crucial point. These early leaders, they weren't coming out of the gate declaring war or demanding immediate independence. They had 8 very specific, methodical aims. They wanted to build a democratic movement, politically educate the public, set up a proper headquarters, and foster friendly ties among political workers from all these different regions. But the big one, the absolute core of it all, was unifying people. They were trying to bridge these massive divides across religion, caste, and province by rallying everyone around a shared political and economic program. They were literally building the very concept of Indian nationhood from the ground up. Moving into Section 2, the moderate approach. To really grasp how these early leaders went about their daily political business, we have to talk about the moderates. These were the foundational heavyweights, men like Dadabhai Naoroji, Feroz Shah Mehta, and S.N. Banerjee. They totally dominated the early policymaking, and they were hardcore believers in liberalism and slow, orderly progress. They genuinely believed that the British inherently wanted to be just, but were basically clueless about the harsh realities on the ground in India. So because of that, they figured maintaining political ties with Britain was actually the smartest play for India at that specific moment in history. To them, the timing just wasn't right for a direct, forceful confrontation. Since they weren't ready to go toe-to-toe, they leaned heavily on a strategy that became known as prayer and petition. Now that sounds a bit mild, right? But the game plan was to slowly nudge colonial rule to look as much like national rule as humanly possible. They figured if they could rally public opinion and politely present their demands through well-reasoned petitions, resolutions, and town halls, well, the British authorities would eventually concede. It was all about constitutional agitation, strictly playing by the rules and staying within the confines of the law. Which brings us to Section 3, the economic drain theory. Now, don't let all that polite petitioning fool you. These guys were sharp. They successfully forged an absolutely devastating intellectual weapon against British imperialism, the drain theory. This is arguably their crowning intellectual achievement.
Early leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji, R.C. Dutt, and Dinshaw Wacha took a magnifying glass to the political economy of British rule. They didn't just sit around complaining about poverty. No, they used hard economic data to prove that the colonial government was systematically siphoning India's wealth away. They brilliantly shifted all India public opinion, proving that British rule wasn't some benevolent civilizing mission, but actually the root cause of India's poverty and economic backwardness. They went hard against the exact mechanics of this exploitation, which was essentially a three-step gut punch. Before the British, India was largely self-sufficient, but colonial rule totally flipped that into a subordinate economy. Step 1, they reduced India to just a supplier of raw materials and food. Step 2, they forced India to become a massive importer of finished British goods. And Step 3, they turned the whole country into a lucrative playground for British capital investment. It was just a structural, systematic draining of wealth. All right, on to Section 4, campaigning for reforms. So, armed with this irrefutable economic critique, the nationalists aimed their sights at the legislative councils. They wanted to hack the system from the inside out, which is kind of wild when you realize these councils basically had zero official power until about 1920. But get a load of this tiny number, 45. Over a span of 30 long years, from 1862 to 1892, a grand total of 45 Indians were nominated to these councils. And pretty much all of them were super wealthy elites with deep loyalties to the British crown. The early nationalists wanted real constitutional reform. Their endgame was democratic self-government, but their immediate goal was simply getting more actual Indians into these councils and giving them real control over the finances. In 1892, the British passed the Indian Councils Act, which was supposed to be throwing them a bone. But the nationalists were not having it. They tore into these so-called reforms at their Congress sessions. The moderates turned up the heat, demanding a majority of elected Indians and actual power over the budget, meaning the power to vote on it and amend it. They rallied hard behind a slogan you might recognize, "No taxation without representation." It was a brilliant strategic move that really stoked widespread anti-imperialist fire among the general public. On top of that, they waged this relentless, highly logical campaign for massive administrative reforms. They started by demanding the Indianization of government service, and they argue this from two angles. Economically, they pointed out that highly paid British bureaucrats were just sending their salaries and pensions back to England, which obviously worsened the economic drain. Morally, they protested the blatant discrimination keeping Indians out of trusted positions. They also pushed for the separation of judicial and executive powers to prevent tyranny, slammed aggressive foreign policies that were bleeding the Indian treasury dry, and demanded way more funding for health, sanitation, and education. And crucially, through all of this, they were constantly fighting tooth and nail to protect basic civil rights like freedom of speech, association, and a free press. Finally, Section 5, Legacy of the Moderates. So, as we wrap things up today, let's take an objective look at the balance sheet for this era. What did these polite, petition-writing early nationalists actually pull off? Well, it's a really mixed bag. In the win column, they absolutely represented the most progressive forces of their era. They successfully woke up a massive national sentiment, trained an entire generation in modern political organizing, and cemented the core idea that India should be ruled for Indians. By totally exposing the exploitative nature of colonialism with the drain theory, they completely shattered the moral justification for British rule. But in the loss column, their social base was incredibly narrow. They totally failed to expand their democratic reach, basically leaving out the vast majority of India, especially women and the working classes, who ended up just watching from the sidelines during this period. I mean, they didn't even push for universal voting rights. And that brings us to one final lingering thought. The moderates operated on this assumption that all the diverse groups in Indian society needed to be perfectly welded into a unified nation before they could really enter the political arena. But what they missed was that the act of participating in the freedom struggle itself was exactly what would unite everyone. The moderates built an unbelievably strong intellectual foundation, but the masses? They were still waiting. Which leaves us with a huge question. What exactly would be the spark to finally ignite those massive militant mass movements we see in the coming decades? That's all for this explainer. Keep questioning the history that shapes our world.